Honorable Member Vieux-Fort South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for recognizing my light as quickly as you did today. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the explanatory note to legislation often never tells the whole story as to why legislation is being introduced. It seeks basically to explain the various provisions and what the provisions say. That being said, however, Mr. Speaker, the principle of set-off is well known, well understood, not just in our private law, but also otherwise in other legal affairs, so that there can never really be any serious objection to a principle of set-off. And with the government of St. Lucia having different revenue agencies, there's no harm in the different revenue agencies being brought together to exercise principles of set-off. So really, this is nothing new. Indeed, one might even argue that there is no need for legislation to govern this because the principle is already practiced in the public service. There have been several instances in the past where set-off has been granted to nullify one tax commitment to one agency to another, or to circumstances where an individual or company has money owed due to them by the government, and that money is used to pay off another agency. So the principle is understood, it's practiced, and it's debatable whether you need legislation. But if the authorities that we feel they need the protection of legislation, there is, in my view, no harm. It would have been good, however, to get a statement on the frequency and extent of the problem. Whether this is a pervasive problem in the public service, whether it's a pervasive problem in relation to the income tax department, the customs department, or the problem is so deep that it warrants this intervention, or whether this is warranted because particular companies or individuals are affected. And again, there's no quarrel if, of course, the principle is exercised to deal with those issues. But the question is whether it is so pervasive and widespread that you require this. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I want very quickly to echo the comments made by the Leader of the Opposition, but perhaps to enhance it with a gloss or to expand on what he has indicated. The problem that the Leader of the Opposition is raising is affected across the board to all three bills before the House, but with different degrees of severity. And perhaps we can take the Income Tax Amendment Act, the bill before us initially, and then as we proceed with the Finance Administration Amendment Act and the Customs Control and Management Act, where the problem is most pervasive and it is at its deepest, or rather, let me just go through that very quickly. Yes, where the problem is perhaps at its deepest. The problem is this. I am aware that the current position of Director of Finance and the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, have been merged. So the Permanent Secretary functions also as Director of Finance. That position is cast at grade 21. Of course, when you look at the Finance Act, it clearly draws a distinction between the Director of Finance and the Permanent Secretary. the Constitution recognizes the permanent secretary as the accounting officer, the head of the department. So the director of finance is junior or supposed to be junior to the permanent secretary, except of course where the post is merged, as in this case. But there's no question that there's a blurring of the financial powers and authorities of the two functionaries. But I'm not going to go there today. I'll leave that for another time. The fact of the matter is that the controller is appointed, I believe, at grade 20. The director of finance and planning is also at grade 20. So you have a situation on the Income Tax Act where two co-equals are operating with each other on the assumption that the director of finance is not the permanent secretary finance. So you have a situation where the controller will direct a co-equal, the director of finance, to set off. Now, clearly that has to be unheard of. And furthermore, the director of finance is not the head of the department. What if the permanent secretary, if the two posts are separated, says to the director of finance, you can't do this? The director of finance can argue, well, statute allows me to override you even though you're head of the department. And the director of finance may be right that this is what Parliament says. But the response clearly of the permanent secretary could well be, but the Constitution says I'm head of the department. And this should not happen. As I said, Mr. Speaker, the problem may well be resolved if, of course, that there is a difference in terminology, a difference in language. But you can't have a situation where persons who are essentially co-equals one is directing the other. So I believe that to avoid administrative confusion and to bring some clarity, some definition of nomenclature is absolutely necessary and vital. So really, there are 2 points. One, setup is understood, necessary, though it would have been a good thing to know how pervasive the problem is. Number 2, the approach can take serious administrative dichotomies, can cause serious administrative confusion if the current language is maintained. Because you cannot have one grade 20 directing another grade 20 who is in fact a junior in a situation where you may have the two posts separated, as is likely to happen someday again. So in my view, some serious rethinking has to be done to the provision, to the section, to ensure that there is statutory comity with the proposed amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.